Welcome back to the Carbon Exposure Project, where we explore the people, policies, and pathways shaping the future of climate finance. Today's episode is part of a special collaboration with This Week in Carbon, hosted by Edward Smith and recorded live at the IETA European Climate Summit in Lisbon. Our guest is Stephanie Zhu, Director of Climate at Yum Brands and formerly General Manager of Sustainability at Delta Airlines. During her time at Delta, Stephanie helped to shape the climate strategy in one of the hardest sectors to decarbonize, aviation, and now she's doing it again, this time in food and agriculture. In this conversation, she unpacks the challenges corporates face when engaging in carbon markets, from sourcing credits to navigating shifting standards, and argues for a pragmatic path forward, using carbon as one tool among many, while staying focused on what actually drives impact. She also calls out the paradox at the heart of this market, why the companies doing the most often face the loudest criticism. It's a sharp, honest, and insightful conversation with one of the clearest voices in the world of corporate sustainability. I hope you enjoy the episode as much as I did. Welcome to the Carbon Exposure Project.
It's great to be here live from the European Climate Summit on This Week in Carbon. And now we have our guest, Stephanie Zhu, who is a good friend. Thank you for joining. And I think it'd be great to start just by, talking about your background, because you obviously have a wealth of experience in corporate sustainability and, an excellent background from aviation to agriculture. And I think, for the audience, it'd be great if you could unpack that and just give yourself, maybe introduce yourself and your background to set the scene.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to do this interview. So I actually started my career in finance and investment banking, and then made the shift into the ESG index space. I was working at FTSE for Good for a number of years, essentially working with companies and their in-house sustainability teams on what policies they had around environmental, climate change, human rights, and things like that. And then after a couple years, a role at Delta opened up. So I actually went in-house, did sustainability, and built that program and worked on sustainability from an airline perspective for about 12 years. And then recently I moved over and doing similar things in-house at Yum Brands and lead the climate work there. So yeah, I've spent about 15 years in the ESG and sustainability space.
Yeah, significant experience regarding the carbon market as well. We have the biggest corporate buyer from Delta Airlines sitting right next to us. It's like but I think it'd be good, because I'm interested, to hear about your experience operating at one of the largest airlines in the world, and also working with, partners in the voluntary carbon markets to drive emissions reductions and invest in carbon offset projects, right? So I think, what was your experience like at Delta Airlines within the voluntary carbon market?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think in both of these corporations that I worked in, they are both considered hard to decarbonize sectors. And I think, a lot of these companies, they look for opportunities, like how can we reduce impact from our operations? So what can we actually do to reduce our emissions? And a lot of times those things take time. They take investments, things don't happen overnight. And so investing in the voluntary carbon market, like it was at Delta, was sort of like an interim thing that we could do. So long term, we were focused on aircraft. We were focused on all the other things that we can do to reduce our Scope 1 emissions. But if we think about it, there's a lot of conversation around the Amazon and deforestation. We really need to end that by 2030 if we're going to have a shot at 1.5 degrees. So investing in the voluntary carbon market and ensuring we're investing in these projects that are reducing climate change, that's sort of like the lever we can pull right now. Let's reduce emissions now. And then let's also at the same time continue to invest in better technologies, like better buildings, like that we're doing right now with Yum, agriculture, and long-term solutions. So from our perspective, looking at the voluntary carbon market is one tool in the toolbox. And when we're thinking about climate change, it's kind of like you have to do everything. Like
Yeah.
if we're going to have a shot at this, every lever has to be pulled between
Yeah.
now and 2050.
Like you have to reduce internally,
Yep.
and as well as invest externally for
externally.
residual emissions, your scope 3. But yeah, I think a lot of corporates and specifically the critics of the markets kind of use offsets as a way to, they say, oh, they're escaping internal emissions reductions by investing in this project, where you should reduce and invest. That's
Correct.
the main point,
Yeah.
right?
And I don't think that there are any companies who will be investing in the carbon market space, whether that's, energy through RECs or EACs. I don't think there's going to be any company that's investing in carbon credits that's not also doing things
that's
internally.
not also reducing internally, right?
Exactly. And I think everything happens at a different speed. If you're talking about like things with deforestation, we have this deadline of 2030, like things have to happen by a certain time. Some technologies, even with removals, may not happen or may not scale until further on. So I think it's an approach where all of these organizations are looking at every possibility and thinking in the short term, what are the things we can do? In the medium term, what are things we can do? And then in the long term, what are the technologies that will come into play that's going to help our sector basically become net zero?
100%. I mean, they have to compensate for their pollution, right? It's a negative externality. So on average, companies that are offsetting their residual emissions are also internally reducing their emissions by 5 times greater than companies that are not. So it's a great point that you made. But I also wanted to talk about your story transitioning. Actually, rewind. I would rather talk about your experience working with voluntary carbon market players during your time at Delta, and maybe some of the challenges that you encountered within the carbon market in your role there within the aviation sector, which is the only hard to abate sector with the 2050 net zero goal, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I've talked about this at length, like during the time that I was, purchasing carbon offsets. And so I think the biggest thing that I always come back to is that the carbon offset market, it is very complex and it is very nuanced. So I think a lot of times in corporate sustainability, there isn't going to be a person in-house that is a carbon offset purchasing or trading expert. And so for somebody to come in, whether for voluntary or even for compliance purposes, if someone comes to you and says like, hey, we want to go and buy offset credits, like, please go and purchase. It's hard to cut into that and say, okay, what am I supposed to be looking at? Like, what things are really important? Is it additionality? What does additionality really mean? Vintages, like we had a portfolio come to us and had questions about vintages early on in 2012, 2013. We didn't really know. We had to ask the questions like, what should we be looking at? What is best practice? And just what are the types of projects and what regions and what pricing? So it's very difficult to sort of get access to all of this information and decipher it and then build like this ideal portfolio and then have to execute. So I think really the challenge is, I would say, the amount of time it kind of takes to ramp up to the point where we felt comfortable going back, asking for a certain portfolio, and then having the steps done where we can say, this is what we're looking for in a certain portfolio. This is how we're going to execute. Your finance, your legal, and other teams internally are kind of on board, and it just becomes a little more of a, of a process that's understood. So I think the nuance and just the amount of detail and information around this market does make it very tough. It makes it very
complex.
Yes.
And it's the internal capacity within the companies. That's, like you said, one of the biggest challenges is the internal expertise to be able to navigate through the nuances and complexities of the market. And this is why, we're seeing some of the largest tech companies in the world, such as Amazon and Meta and Microsoft and Google, they, hire folks from the carbon removal industry or the carbon market. And then they have those individuals run their carbon programs because they now have the in-house expertise to do so. So I think Yeah, a lot of corporate sustainability teams struggle with the constantly evolving rules and regulations and policy changes around the market, specifically with regards to the Science-Based Targets
Yep.
Initiative. There's over 7,500 corporates that have a science-based target, and now the Science-Based Targets Initiative keeps kind of they've been doing a great job, but they flip-flop on their stance with the use of carbon removals and carbon offsets, so it delays action.
Yep.
And it confuses
Yep.
a lot of sustainability teams.
100%.
Yeah, and every sector is completely different, right? Their approach, right? So you went from aviation decarbonization at Delta to then transitioning to climate strategy and decarbonization in agriculture at Yum Brands. So do you think what was the experience like transitioning to a completely different sector, and what are some of the challenges that you found in your current role decarbonizing agriculture?
Yeah, so I can speak to a couple things around this. So the first is both of these sectors are hard to decarbonize. I think addressing sustainability and climate change is difficult across the board. But with aviation, there are sort of industry targets like CORSIA, like you had mentioned, net zero by 2050. And so there was an industry group trying to say, like, what can we do around sustainable aviation fuel?
Yeah.
And then with CORSIA, it's like,
IATA,
what are the credits? Exactly.
IATA,
Like, what are the
ACE,
credits that kind of qualify under CORSIA? And, we were kind of all working together towards that as an industry. And then at Yum, for us, the two biggest things are, how do we make our restaurants more efficient? There's more than 55,000 restaurants around the world. So how do we make our restaurants more run efficiently on energy? And then renewable energy, how do we kind of apply that on top? And then the other part of it in our supply chain, which is also very different from Delta, a lot of our emissions are actually in our Scope 3 supply chain. And all of that almost has to do with food. So how do we engage with our suppliers around food to reduce emissions, which is also very difficult. And you think about who is going to be funding this? How do we get quote unquote credit around this? And that comes back to your SBTI question. Because at the end of the day, the similarities I think around any of these corporations are, you will have a sustainability target, and then ultimately you're building a business case on what can we do and what can we implement that's going to help address those sustainability targets and reduce emissions on our ledger. And I think a lot of organizations have kind of coalesced around science-based targets. And one of the things is like, how do we track our targets against what science-based targets has kind of put out to say, this is how you make progress on whether it's your short-term emissions or your long-term emissions. And I agree with you, having that kind of clarity on, if we were to do things that are a little bit directly outside of our suppliers, whether it's through carbon offset programs throughout the world, or even working with suppliers in supply sheds and things like that for agriculture, just having clarity on how you can account for that and how companies can claim progress around that. I think that would be a huge thing in terms of being able to invest money and pushing progress around a lot of these initiatives.
Yeah, it's very complex, the value chains of these companies within each sector, right? Because everyone has to play a role. And for the most part, it's voluntary, right? Specifically from the lens of the US, let's say, because to add another layer of complexity, every jurisdiction is different. And every country is different, right? So specifically in the US, for multinational corporations, they have obligations in different countries, like the UK or the EU and Asia and Singapore. And it's mostly voluntary for the companies in the US. So there's this paradox of, companies that invest, let's say $100 into offsetting their emissions. Instead of people applauding them and saying, great for, compensating for your pollution, they say, why didn't you invest $200? It's almost like, imagine donating to a charity. Instead of the charity saying thank you, they say, why didn't you invest more, right? that's the voluntary paradox of the market, and it's actually very unfortunate to see because these projects that have such great impacts on the ground for environmental benefits, biodiversity, socioeconomic benefits, get the most scrutiny if they make any slight mistake compared to projects that destroy biodiversity and destroy the the planets. Those projects, a mistake happens, it's all right. It's just, a profitable ongoing business, right? But yeah, it's good to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah.
And I think, but you have any perspective on some of the ways that we can solve these challenges, I guess, from a corporate lens moving forward? How do we get corporates more bought in to the offset markets and more invested in, okay, this is a solution that we have available today that we can use and we can, and make the world a better place instead of waiting and delaying action?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. And I think the concept that I use often, whether it's around this or anything in corporate sustainability, is to drive action and to move the needle. We really need to approach this in a pragmatic way. So with the carbon markets, with carbon accounting, with so many things, you can get really lost in the nuance, the details, and
get distracted.
If I'm not, I'm not an expert in the carbon market, and it took me a long time to learn these things, but you can really get lost into the minutia, looking into different projects, like really, there's a lot in there. And then you kind of need to take a step back and say, like, okay, if I'm trying to do this either for a corporation or trying to make the right decisions, what do I really need to know? So I think really taking a pragmatic approach that don't let details and perfect be the enemy of making progress. And I think that's similar for whether you're trying to invest in the carbon market or trying to implement initiatives, honestly, to reduce emissions. Let's not make carbon accounting, the carbon accounting details, the enemy of making progress. Like we know, like generally, when you work in an organization, what are the big 3 to 5 levers that you can to pull in order to make progress, and let common sense, like, let's invest in those initiatives and be able to take credit, talk about it as progress, and just be realistic and pragmatic, because we just need to make progress.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, we foresee a future where companies that are able to actually mitigate their emissions and compensate for their pollution will be more cost competitive at some point in the future. But right now, that's just not the case.
Yeah.
And
we need to scale. We need to scale.
Yeah, it needs to scale, and we need the voluntary market to. There's a lot of over bureaucracy. We're almost shooting ourselves in the foot because everyone's on the same team. Everyone's trying to work together. But when we criticize each other for little mistakes, it really delays action and leaves people that don't even have to be taking action kind of saying, oh, too complicated. I'm just gonna, push back my target, or, completely get rid of my targets, which is what we've seen this past year. So,
exactly. Yeah. When it comes to climate, I think you made a really good point. We all need to be on the same team, and we all need to figure out the best way to move forward faster.
Yeah, 100%. Well said. Well, thank you for joining today.
For having me.
Yeah, that was awesome.
It's great.